everyone. Hope you're having a great morning. I wanted to hop on and talk to you guys about a word that God has just really put in my spirit the entire day today, and that word is courageous. And it made me think of that movie from years ago called Courageous. I don't know if you guys ever saw that movie. It was a powerful movie, a really good movie. If you guys haven't seen it, you should go check it out. But God was showing me the importance of leaders that He is raising up in this season who are called to be courageous. And He was showing me how His definition of courageous is very different from the world, the way that the world typically sees it. And so that's kind of what I wanted to talk to you guys about today. His definition of a courageous person has so much more to do with character than just physically facing, scary things in the natural kind of thing. I feel like that's more of the world's definition, is that kind of a concept. But God's kind of a concept is so incredibly different, and it's actually harder in some ways. Amen. So what does it look like to live a lifestyle of being courageous is what I want to chat about today. So let me give you an example from the Bible of something that typically the world would think of as being courageous with your life. The Bible talks about how David fought off the lion and the bear. That's a typical worldly example of what we would typically think of as being courageous, right? Facing a wild animal, brute strength, going after things, fighting stuff off, pure athletic ability, we think of that kind of stuff typically as being courageous. And I'm not saying that there's no component to that, there is. But what God is wanting to raise up are people of courageous character. Amen. And those are hard to find. And the cool thing about David in the Bible is he not only had the other stuff, like he was willing to face giants and do all this stuff in the natural, but his character piece, which is the most important piece to God, was one of being courageous as well. And that's what I want to talk to you guys about today. How many of you guys know that it takes a lot of courage to stand on the promises of God when nothing else makes sense in your personal life? When it goes against the status quo, when it goes against what friends and family are wanting you to do. That's true courage, ladies and gents. And David did this in many different areas of his life. So we see this, for example, when he was... he had the opportunity to kill Saul. I don't know if you guys remember this story, but Saul was out to kill David. So David would have been quote unquote justified, right? And going and killing off Saul because he was literally after his life and wanted David dead, right? And David in that moment said, no, I'm going to point it out so that Saul knows that I could have done this thing to him, but I'm going to let the Lord handle my enemies. And he didn't kill him. That's courage, ladies and gents. It's courage to trust God in moments where we're tempted to take things into our own hands, It's courage to trust God to fight for us, to hold on to His promises in seasons where it looks like the complete opposite, is going on in our personal lives. It takes courage in so many different areas and a stance of integrity to hang on through seasons. Let's say that God told you, you're not called to date around. You're called to, focus on me in this season. And, I want to take care of you in this area of your life. Well, when you've got family and friends pressuring you on every side, it takes courage to stand strong in that stuff. Amen. It takes courage to believe God in those areas of your life. And that's the kind of courageous that God is wanting to raise up in His leaders in this season. He's wanting to raise up people who are willing to take a stance for Him no matter what. It takes courage when that coworker is talking trash about you at work 24/7 to keep your mouth shut and to let God fight for you on circumstances. It takes courage in those situations. There's so many different ways that we could apply this. It takes courage to depend on God to go before you in the place of battle. It takes courage to walk in a place of integrity in your personal life. I want to ask you, are you a person who just has the physical courageousness on your life, or are you a person that has the character courageousness on your life? Being courageous is a boldness, to step out on the things of God when it doesn't make sense. Another person I think of in the Bible is Noah. Have you guys thought about how ridiculous it must have looked in the natural when they had never seen rain? For him to just spend his life building this giant boat, think about how his relatives might have mocked him. Think about, how ridiculous that might have looked in the natural. And yet, got a car alarm going off outside. I apologize, guys. I'm going to keep going. But think about how silly that would have looked, ladies and gents. Think about how ridiculous that would have been to an onlooker. And yet, it takes courage to hold fast to the promises of God. Sometimes you've got to be willing to look foolish, quote unquote, to people in the natural to take a stance of courage in your life. And aren't you glad that Noah obeyed? Because that's one of the reasons we're still here today, right? And so all of that to say, courageousness has a lot to do with your stance of obedience in your life. And it has a lot to do with holding on to what God said in your personal life when everything else in the natural looks different. And it has to do with integrity, right? When you are walking in what God has for you, and when you're obedient, and when you're not taking a stance where you're just running away from problems, but you are, pushing through them and approaching things in a godly manner, that's courage, ladies and gents, because the majority of the world, I hate to say it, but the majority of the world does not operate that way. Amen. Can we have some truth talk today? The majority of the world takes the easy way out. The majority of the world falls into compromise. The majority of the world will listen to God when it's convenient for them and when it looks good to, social appearances. But when God asks them to do something that's hard, to be set apart, to do, something that requires a lot of integrity or that may not make sense to the people around them, so many people cave in those moments. Amen. And God is looking to raise up courageous leaders in this season. And he's looking for a place of character from those leaders. Amen. It's easy, quote unquote, to fight off a lion and a bear. I'm not saying it's super easy in the natural and that just anybody could do that. But what I'm saying is the brute strength kind of stuff and, all of that the world typically thinks of as courageous, there's quite a few people who could do that, right? There are very few people who are courageous in the Lord and who depend on him to be their source of strength in their personal life. And so if God is calling you to hard things, if God is calling you to things that don't make sense in your personal life, be obedient, because that stance of being courageous and depending on God and trusting in him when nothing else makes sense will always pay off in your life. Joseph is another great example of this, God gave him a word. And then he was thrown into a season where people mocked him, they ridiculed him, they rejected him, they tossed him aside. He was accused of things falsely. He went through this whole season of his life. And then he had to go back and face the very people who did all of this stuff to him. But guess what? God raised him up. Amen. God intervened in that situation. And Joseph was courageous because it takes courage sometimes to hang on to God and his word, especially when everything else in the natural looks completely opposite to what God has spoken to you. Amen. It takes courage to not give up in stormy seasons. It takes courage to not give up when you've been wrongfully done by the people around you, when you've been accused, when you've been blamed. It takes courage to still treat people kindly and even to help people when you're in the midst of one of the biggest personal storms that you've ever walked through in your entire life. It takes courage, ladies and gents, but it will always pay off. Joseph was promoted to be one of the top people in the land. Amen. David was promoted to be king. That's why not many of these leaders exist, because very few people are willing to go through the process and be a part of this. So are you willing to be courageous today? That's our word. Amen. And I'm not just talking courageous in terms of facing scary things or, whatever that looks like in the natural. I'm talking about, are you going to have a character stance of being courageous and of holding fast to the things of the Lord? Amen. Hope you guys have a great day. I'll chat with you again soon.